The rain had soaked through Clara's jacket 3 blocks ago, and now the cold water dripped from her hair down the back of her neck as she pushed through the brass revolving door of the Whitmore Tower, leaving puddles on the pristine marble floor that someone else would have to clean because she was late, and Mr. Hastings was going to crucify her for it. Her sneakers squeaked as she rushed toward the service elevator, the sound echoing through the vast lobby with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers that cost more than she would earn in 5 years of scrubbing toilets and emptying trash bins on the upper floors, where people in tailored suits made decisions that shaped the city. She was 20 minutes late, maybe 22 now. The bus had broken down and her phone was dead, and she had run half the distance in the downpour because she could not afford to lose this job, not when rent was due in 4 days, and her landlord had already warned her about late payments. Her supervisor stood by the service corridor entrance with his arms crossed over his barrel chest, his face set in that expression of vindictive satisfaction that told her everything before he even opened his mouth. "You are done, Clara." His voice was flat and final. She felt the words like a fist to her stomach. "Mr. Hastings, please, I can explain there was an accident on the bus route, and I ran here as fast as I could." He held up one hand to silence her. "I do not want excuses. I want reliability, and you have been late 4 times in 2 months." Her throat tightened. "Twice because my neighbor had a medical emergency, and once because your own scheduling system double-booked me, and I had to wait for." He was already shaking his head. "Clear out your locker and leave your badge at the desk." The unfairness of it burned in her chest, but she knew that nothing she said would matter, because to men like Hastings, she was invisible until she was inconvenient. She opened her mouth to try one more time when movement caught her eye past his shoulder. A little girl stood at the far end of the service hallway where no child should ever be, especially not at 8 in the evening, when the building was mostly empty except for cleaning crews and late working executives on the high floors. The girl wore a private school uniform with a navy blazer and plaid skirt, expensive fabrics even from this distance. But what stopped Clara's breath was the look on the child's face. Lost. Frightened. The kind of fear that raises every protective instinct Clara did not know she still possessed. The girl's eyes were too wide, and her small hands clutched at her skirt, and there was something wrong about the way she glanced over her shoulder, as if something pursued her through the sterile corridors of glass and steel. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel, and comment where you are watching from, and what time is it? It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Clara pushed past Mr. Hastings without asking permission, because something was very wrong with the picture of that little girl alone in the service corridor. And her supervisor's voice rose behind her in angry protest, but she was already moving toward the child who took a step back when Clara approached, as if every adult had become a potential threat. "Easy, sweetheart. I am not going to hurt you." Clara kept her voice soft and low as she knelt down to the girl's level, and that was when she saw the blood trickling from a scrape on the child's knee through a torn section of her tights, and the way the girl was shaking had nothing to do with cold. "What is your name?" The girl's lip trembled. "Sophia. Where are your parents, honey?" The question made Sophia's eyes fill with tears that she blinked back with a control that seemed far too practiced for someone so young. "My driver was supposed to pick me up from piano lessons, but he never came, and then these men came instead, and Miss Cardwell told me to run, so I ran." Clara's heart kicked hard against her ribs. "What men?" Before Sophia could answer, Mr. Hastings was there with his hand closing around Clara's arm to yank her back to her feet. "This is not your concern. You are fired, and you need to leave now before I call security." Clara jerked her arm free with more force than she knew she possessed. "She is hurt and scared, and I am not leaving her alone." She turned back to Sophia and pulled a tissue from her pocket to dab carefully at the scrape. Sophia winced, but did not pull away. "The bad men are still looking for me." Sophia's whisper was so quiet Clara almost missed it. "They said my father would pay for what he did." The words sent ice through Clara's veins because this was not a lost child situation, this was something darker and more dangerous. Mr. Hastings was on his radio now, calling for building security, and Clara knew she had seconds to make a decision. She glanced toward the lobby entrance visible through the corridor's glass partition, and her blood went cold. 3 men in dark suits were moving through the main doors, with the kind of purposeful stride that said they were hunting. They did not look like corporate executives or lost visitors. One of them scanned the lobby with the clinical efficiency of a predator, and when his gaze swept toward the service corridor, Clara grabbed Sophia's hand and pulled her back toward the alcove where the security monitor station sat unmanned because the night guard was doing his rounds. The screen showed 4 camera feeds, and Clara watched the men split up with 2 heading toward the main elevators and 1 moving directly toward the service entrance. Sophia squeezed Clara's hand so tightly it hurt. Those are them. Clara's mind raced through options that all seemed terrible. She could call the police, but that would take time they did not have. She could try to get Sophia out through the front, but those men were covering the exits. Mr. Hastings appeared again with building security, and Clara made a choice that went against every self-preservation instinct, screaming at her to walk away to save herself, to let someone else handle this nightmare. She looked at Sophia's terrified face and knew there was no universe in which she could abandon this child. Clara spun toward the supply closet, 15 feet down the corridor, and pulled Sophia with her, while Mr. Hastings shouted something about liability and legal consequences. But his voice faded as Clara yanked open the metal door and shoved Sophia inside among the mops and industrial cleaning solutions that smelled like bleach and artificial lemon. Stay quiet, no matter what you hear. She pulled the door closed just as the security guard rounded the corner with one of the suited men right behind him, and Clara forced herself to look confused and irritated instead of terrified as the stranger's gaze swept over her with cold calculation. The man was tall with silver threaded through dark hair and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, and when he spoke his voice carried the kind of authority that expected obedience. We are looking for a child, a girl about 7 years old in a school uniform. Clara widened her eyes and shook her head. I just got here and got fired actually, so I have not seen any kids. The lie came easier than it should have, and she wondered distantly when she had become someone who could look danger in the face and fabricate stories without her voice shaking. The man studied her for 3 long seconds that felt like hours, and Clara knew he was deciding whether she was worth the effort of interrogation. Mr. Hastings interjected with officious helpfulness that Clara had only arrived 20 minutes ago and was being terminated for tardiness, and the man's attention shifted away from her like she had ceased to exist at all. They moved past her down the corridor, and Clara waited until they turned the corner before she opened the closet door and found Sophia pressed against the back wall with her hand over her own mouth to keep silent and tears streaming down her face. Clara's heart cracked at the sight. Come on, sweetheart, we need to move. She knew this building better than almost anyone after 18 months of cleaning every floor, and she knew about the service stairs that connected the sub-level storage areas to the loading dock and the freight elevator that opened onto the parking garage. She took Sophia's hand and led her away from the main corridor into the narrow passageway that maintenance used to move between floors without being seen by the building's wealthy tenants who preferred to pretend that trash removed itself and floors cleaned themselves by magic. The passage was dim, with flickering fluorescent lights that hummed and cast everything in sallow yellow, and their footsteps echoed too loudly, no matter how carefully Clara tried to move. Sophia stayed close enough that Clara could feel the child's breath on her arm. Your father, what is his name? Sophia's answer came in a whisper that made Clara's stomach drop. Nicholas Darcy. Clara had heard that name and seen that face on the news during reports about organized crime and federal investigations, and the kind of power that operated outside the law. This child was the daughter of a man who controlled half the city's underground, and that meant the men hunting her were not just criminals, they were rival criminals. And Sophia was a pawn in whatever war was being waged in the shadows. Clara should have been running in the opposite direction, should have been protecting herself, should have been anywhere but in this stairwell with a mob boss's daughter. But when she looked down at Sophia's small hand gripping hers with desperate trust, she knew that none of that mattered, because this was a scared little girl who needed someone to care more about her safety than their own. "We are going to get you somewhere safe, I promise." Sophia nodded, and Clara saw belief in those wide eyes and prayed she could actually keep that promise. They reached the loading dock level, and Clara could see the service exit 30 feet ahead with its push bar glowing red in the emergency lighting when a figure stepped out from behind a stack of cardboard boxes, and Clara's heart stopped because it was one of them. Another man in a dark suit, and this one was younger with cold eyes that locked onto Sophia with immediate recognition. "There you are." His voice was casual, almost friendly, which made it more terrifying, and he moved to block their path with the kind of confidence that said he knew they had nowhere to go. "Mr. Colborne has been looking everywhere for you, little girl." Clara felt Sophia press against her side, trembling, and something fierce and primal surged up through Clara's chest, something that burned away the fear and left only raw, protective instinct. She stepped in front of Sophia, putting her body between the child and the threat. "You need to leave us alone." The man laughed and the sound echoed off concrete walls. "You do not know what you are in the middle of, lady, so do yourself a favor and walk away." Clara's mind raced, cataloging her surroundings with desperate speed, and her eyes landed on the janitorial cart she had left near the loading dock entrance 2 days ago, loaded with supplies she had never put away because her shift had been cut short. She had seconds before he moved, and she could see in his posture that he was about to. She shoved Sophia toward the exit. "Run." Then Clara grabbed the cart and pushed it with every ounce of strength she possessed, sending it careening toward the man who stepped aside easily. But the cart was not the real weapon. It was the distraction, and Clara was already moving, grabbing the industrial spray bottle of ammonia cleaner from the cart's holder and spraying directly into his face as he turned back toward her. He shouted and stumbled backward, clawing at his eyes, and Clara did not wait to see what happened next because Sophia was already at the door pushing it open, and rain and cold air rushed in. Clara ran after her into the storm that soaked them both instantly, and the alley was dark and filled with dumpsters and the smell of garbage and oil. Sophia was gasping for breath, and Clara grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the street because staying still meant getting caught. Her apartment was 6 blocks away, and Clara had no car and no money for a cab, and the streets were nearly empty because of the rain and the late hour. She made a decision driven by instinct rather than logic. "We are going to my place. You can call your father from there." Sophia nodded, unable to speak, and they ran together through rain that felt like needles, and Clara kept looking over her shoulder expecting to see pursuit, but the alley behind them stayed empty. When they reached Clara's building, she fumbled with her keys, and her hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the door open, and then they were inside, climbing the stairs to the 3rd floor and into her tiny studio apartment that suddenly felt like the most inadequate shelter imaginable. Clara locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle because the lock was flimsy, and then turned to Sophia, who was dripping onto the worn carpet. "We should call the police." Sophia's reaction was immediate and panicked. "No. Please, no police. It will make everything worse. My father says the police cannot help us, and if they come, the bad men will know where I am. And—" Clara knelt down and took Sophia's shoulders gently. Okay, no police, but we need to call your father right now." Clara pulled a towel from the bathroom and wrapped it around Sophia's shoulders before digging through her dresser for something the child could wear, and all she found was an old, oversized shirt that would hang like a dress, but it was dry and warm. "Here, put this on while I look at that scrape." Sophia changed without protest, and Clara knelt beside her with a first aid kit she kept under the sink, cleaning the wound on Sophia's knee with gentle efficiency, while her mind raced through everything that had just happened and everything that was about to happen, because Nicholas Darcy was coming here to this apartment, to her home. Her hands trembled as she applied the bandage, and Sophia watched her with those two observant eyes that seemed to see past every pretense. "You are scared." Clara tried to smile and failed. "A little, but you are safe now. That is what matters." Sophia reached for Clara's phone on the coffee table. "I should call him now." Clara handed it over and watched as Sophia dialed a number from memory, her small fingers moving with practiced precision, and when someone answered, Sophia's entire body seemed to collapse with relief. "Daddy." The word came out as half sob, half prayer, and Clara had to look away from the raw emotion on the child's face because it felt too intimate to witness. "I am okay. I am with a lady named Clara. She saved me from the bad men. We are at her apartment." A pause while Sophia listened, and then she rattled off Clara's address without hesitation, reading it from the mail on the table. And Clara's stomach dropped because this was real, this was happening, and a man who commanded criminals and controlled territory and operated outside every law was about to walk through her door. Sophia held out the phone. "He wants to talk to you." Clara took it with shaking hands and pressed it to her ear. "Hello?" The voice that answered was deep and rough with barely controlled emotion. "Is my daughter hurt?" "No, just a scrape on her knee." "I cleaned it. She is fine." "Where are the men who were chasing her?" "I do not know. We got away and came here." A pause filled with tension and calculation. "You will stay exactly where you are. I will be there in 15 minutes. Keep the door locked and do not open it for anyone but me." The line went dead before Clara could respond, and she stared at the phone feeling like she had swallowed ice. 15 minutes. Sophia was already curling up on Clara's threadbare couch, looking smaller and younger than her 7 years, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline. Clara grabbed a blanket and tucked it around her. "Your father is coming." Sophia nodded with sleepy trust. "He will keep us safe, he always does." The certainty in her voice should have been comforting, but Clara could only think about what it meant that a 7-year-old child had to rely on her father to keep her safe from men who hunted her through buildings and rainstorms. She sat on the edge of the couch and watched Sophia's eyes drift closed, while the clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, and Clara's mind spun through every possible outcome of the next hour. What had she done? She had involved herself in something violent and dangerous, had made herself visible to people who resolved problems with force, had brought the attention of a mafia boss to her home and her life. She could have walked away, could have let someone else find Sophia, could have protected herself. But when she looked at this child sleeping under her blanket with a bandage on her knee and tear tracks still drying on her cheeks, Clara knew she would make the same choice again because some things mattered more than safety. Sophia stirred and opened her eyes just enough to whisper "thank you" before sleep claimed her completely, and those two words cracked something open in Clara's chest, broke through the panic and fear, and left only a fierce protectiveness that terrified her with its intensity. The knock came exactly 15 minutes later, but it was not really a knock, more like a command, and the sound reverberated through Clara's apartment with such force she thought the door might split, and her heart hammered against her ribs as she moved toward it, on legs that felt unsteady. She looked through the peephole and saw men filling the narrow hallway, men in dark suits with hard faces and rain dripping from their shoulders, and in the center of them stood a man who made everyone else disappear because he was taller than the others, and broader, and there was something about the way he held himself that screamed danger and control and barely leashed violence. Clara's breath caught, and her hands fumbled with the lock and the chair she had wedged under the handle, and then the door swung open, and Nicholas Darcy stepped into her apartment, and the space that had always felt small suddenly felt microscopic because he filled it with his presence, with the sharp, clean scent of expensive cologne mixed with rain and the cold air that clung to his coat. He was devastatingly handsome, in a way that felt almost cruel, with dark hair swept back from a face all sharp angles and hard lines, and eyes so dark they looked black in the dim lighting. And those eyes swept across her apartment, cataloging every detail, the peeling paint, and the thrift store furniture, and the water stains on the ceiling, before landing on Clara herself, and she felt stripped bare under that gaze, assessed and measured and seen in a way that made her want to hide. Then his eyes found Sophia asleep on the couch, and everything about him changed in an instant, and the controlled fury melted into something raw and desperate, and he crossed the room in 3 strides, and dropped to his knees beside his daughter with a grace that seemed impossible for a man his size. Sophia. His voice cracked on the name, and he gathered her into his arms and buried his face against her hair, and Sophia woke with a start, but relaxed immediately recognizing him. Daddy. I knew you would come. Clara stood frozen by the door watching this moment of pure unguarded love and vulnerability, and she saw the way his hands shook as he ran them over Sophia checking for injuries, and the way his jaw clenched when he saw the bandage on her knee, and she realized with sudden clarity that this man who commanded fear and operated outside the law was first and foremost a father terrified for his child. One of the men who had entered behind Nicholas moved through the apartment with professional efficiency, checking the windows and the bathroom, and Clara recognized the behavior of someone sweeping for threats, and she pressed herself against the wall, trying to stay out of the way. Nicholas finally looked up at her, and his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. You are Clara. It was not a question, and his voice was deep and rough like gravel wrapped in silk, and it did something strange to her pulse. She nodded because words seemed beyond her capability, and he stood slowly still holding Sophia against his chest. Tell me everything that happened tonight, and do not leave anything out. It was a command delivered with absolute authority, and Clara found herself speaking, explaining the timeline from the moment she saw Sophia in the hallway to their escape through the loading dock to the confrontation with Colborne's man, and Nicholas listened without interrupting. But his expression grew darker with every detail, and when she finished, there was a long silence, filled only with the sound of rain against the windows and the quiet breathing of the men positioned around her apartment like sentinels. Nicholas turned his full attention back to Clara, and the weight of his focus felt like a physical force pinning her against the wall, and she could not look away from those dark eyes that seemed to see through every defense she had ever built. You knew who I was. It was not a question, but she nodded anyway, and he took a step closer, reducing the already small distance between them. You knew, and you still took her to your home, instead of handing her to the police, or leaving her for someone else to find. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, something dangerous and searching, and Clara felt her pulse hammering in her throat. I saw a scared child who needed help. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Nothing else mattered. One of the other men moved through her kitchen opening cabinets and checking behind her refrigerator, and Clara recognized him as older than the others with gray at his temples and cold, calculating eyes that missed nothing. Nicholas did not break eye contact with her. This is George Thornhill, my second in command. George, give me your assessment. The older man finished his inspection and came to stand beside Nicholas, and his gaze raked over Clara with clinical efficiency. Small apartment, ground floor, single occupant, no security system, one exit, plus a fire escape outside the bedroom window. He gestured toward Clara without looking at her. She works as a janitor, recently fired, no family according to the background check we ran on the way here. Clara's stomach dropped. You ran a background check on me. George's expression did not change. Standard protocol when someone has contact with Sophia. Nicholas was still watching her, and she saw the exact moment he catalogued her reaction to that invasion of her privacy, but he did not apologize, did not explain, just continued his interrogation. Why were you at the building tonight? I worked there until my supervisor fired me for being late. Why were you late? Clara hesitated because the reason felt too personal, too small compared to everything else happening, but his eyes demanded truth. My landlord changed the locks without warning. Because I was 3 days late on rent, I had to break my own window to get my uniform, and by the time I got to work, I had already missed the shift start. Something flickered across Nicholas's face too fast for her to identify, and George made a note on his phone, and Clara hated that these strangers now knew how completely her life had fallen apart. Nicholas stepped closer still, and she could smell the rain on his coat, and something else darker, like smoke and leather. The man you encountered in the loading dock, did you injure him? I hit him with a supply cart and we ran. I do not know if he was hurt. Can you describe him? Clara closed her eyes, remembering the moment with perfect clarity, because fear had etched every detail into her memory. Tall, maybe 6 feet blonde hair scar through his left eyebrow, wearing a gray suit, and he had an accent, European, maybe Russian. George and Nicholas exchanged a look loaded with meaning, and George spoke quietly. That matches Viktor Petrov, one of Colborne's enforcers. Nicholas's jaw tightened and he turned back to Clara. Did he see your face clearly? Yes, we were under the loading dock lights. He looked right at me. The silence that followed felt suffocating, and Clara watched Nicholas process this information, watched the calculations happening behind those dark eyes. Sophia stirred on the couch and murmured something in her sleep, and Nicholas glanced at his daughter with an expression so tender it made Clara's chest ache. He looked back at Clara, and when he spoke his voice was quieter but no less intense. Why did you help her when you knew the danger? Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could take care of herself, that she had been doing it for years, but the words died in her throat because Nicholas was right, and she knew it with a cold certainty that settled in her bones like ice, because Viktor Petrov had seen her face, had looked directly at her under those harsh loading dock lights, and men like that did not forget and did not forgive. You cannot go back to your life. Nicholas spoke with finality, as if he were pronouncing sentence, and his eyes never left hers. James Colborne will send men to find you, and when they do, they will not ask questions before they act. Clara felt the walls of her small apartment closing in, and her breath came shallow and fast. So what am I supposed to do? Hide forever, change my name, leave the city? Even as she said it, she knew how impossible that sounded because she had $87 in her bank account and no car and nowhere to go. You will come under my protection. The words were delivered as fact, not suggestion, and Clara saw George shift slightly beside Nicholas, his expression unreadable. I will have you moved to my estate tonight. You will stay there until the threat is neutralized. Clara's heart kicked against her ribs. You are deciding my entire life in my own apartment, like I have no say in it. Something flickered in Nicholas's eyes, something that might have been respect or surprise. You have a say, but you need to understand the reality of your situation. His voice softened by a fraction. Colborne is not a forgiving man, and you have cost him leverage tonight. You have interfered with his plans. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly cold, despite the stuffy warmth of the apartment. And if I refuse, if I take my chances, then you will be dead within 48 hours. George spoke for the first time since his assessment, and his tone was matter-of-fact, clinical. Colborne has people everywhere, including in the police department, so going to them will not help. Nicholas took another step closer, and now he was near enough that Clara could see the faint scar along his jawline and the exhaustion shadowing his eyes beneath the controlled exterior. I am not your enemy, Clara, and I do not make this offer lightly, but I owe you a debt. You saved my daughter when you could have walked away. His voice dropped lower. Let me return that by keeping you alive. Clara wanted to say no, wanted to cling to the shreds of her independence, to the illusion of control over her own existence. But she looked past Nicholas, to where Sophia slept curled on the couch, wearing Clara's oversized shirt, and she remembered the trust in those small hands, and the way the girl had whispered thank you before falling asleep. She looked back at Nicholas, and saw that he was watching her with an intensity that felt like a touch. How long? Until I can come back to my life. I do not know. The honesty in his answer was somehow worse than a lie would have been. Days, weeks, however long it takes. Clara closed her eyes and felt the last remnants of her normal life slipping through her fingers like water. When she opened them again, Nicholas was still waiting, and she saw something in his expression that looked almost like a plea beneath the command. Before she could answer, Sophia stirred and sat up, rubbing her eyes, and when she saw Clara, she smiled with such pure relief that Clara felt something crack open in her chest. "Clara, will you come with us?" Sophia's small voice cut through every argument, every protest. "Please, I want you to come." Clara looked at the little girl, and then at Nicholas, and saw the same hope reflected in both their faces, and she realized her decision had already been made the moment she chose to hide Sophia in that janitor's closet. "Okay," the word came out barely above a whisper. "I will come." The drive to Nicholas's estate took 40 minutes through rain-slicked streets that blurred past the tinted windows of the black SUV, and Clara sat in the back seat with Sophia asleep against her shoulder, while Nicholas drove and George followed in a second vehicle, and she watched the city give way to suburbs and then to tree-lined roads where houses sat far back from the street behind gates and walls. When they finally turned through iron gates that opened automatically, Clara saw the sprawling property unfold before her like something from a movie, all stone and glass, and manicured grounds that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness, and her breath caught, because this was not just wealth, this was power made visible. Nicholas pulled into a circular drive in front of the main entrance and carried Sophia inside, while Clara followed on unsteady legs, her wet shoes squeaking on marble floors that reflected the light from a chandelier that probably cost more than she had earned in her entire life. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a crisp uniform appeared, and Nicholas introduced her as Mrs. Brennan, the housekeeper, and she took Sophia gently from his arms to put the child to bed properly. And Clara stood in the vast entryway feeling impossibly small and out of place. George materialized beside her with a tablet in his hand and launched into a briefing about security protocols, his voice clipped and efficient. "The estate has 24-hour surveillance. All entry points are monitored. You will be given a phone that stays with you at all times. Do not leave the grounds without an escort. Do not contact anyone from your previous life. Do not post on social media. Do not." The list went on, and Clara felt each restriction like a bar sliding into place around her, until the gilded beauty of the mansion felt less like sanctuary and more like the most expensive prison in the world. Nicholas had disappeared somewhere into the depths of the house, and Clara was shown to a guest suite on the second floor by Mrs. Brennan, who explained the locations of towels and fresh clothes and how to use the intercom system if she needed anything, and then left her alone in a room that was larger than her entire apartment had been. Clara stood in the center of the plush carpet and turned slowly, taking in the king-size bed with its cream-colored duvet, the sitting area with furniture that looked too perfect to actually use the ensuite bathroom, visible through an open door, all marble and gold fixtures. She caught sight of herself in a mirror and barely recognized the bedraggled woman staring back, hair still damp from the rain, earlier eyes too wide, face pale with exhaustion and shock. She tried to sleep, but the bed was too soft, the silence too complete, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Viktor Petrov's face, or the cold calculation in George's expression, or the intensity in Nicholas's dark eyes when he had promised to protect her. At 2 in the morning, she gave up and pulled on a robe that had been left hanging in the closet and ventured out into the hallway. The mansion was quieter at night, but not silent. She could hear the distant hum of electronics, the creak of old wood settling, and she wandered down the wide staircase, trailing her fingers along the banister. She found Nicholas in a room lined with bookshelves, a fire burning low in the fireplace, and him sitting in a leather chair with a crystal glass of something amber in his hand, staring into the flames. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the firelight played across his features, softening the hard lines and making him look younger and more tired than she had yet seen him, and then he gestured to the chair across from him in silent invitation. Clara crossed the room and sat feeling the warmth of the fire on her skin, and Nicholas poured a second glass from the decanter on the side table and offered it to her, and she took it, even though she rarely drank because her hands needed something to hold. Could not sleep. His voice was low and rough, as if he had not spoken in hours. Neither could I. Clara took a small sip, and the liquid burned, going down smooth and expensive. The silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable, and she watched the flames dance and tried to find words for the strange unreality of sitting in this beautiful room in the middle of the night with a man who commanded criminals, and yet looked at his daughter with such fierce love. My wife died 3 years ago. Nicholas spoke suddenly, and Clara turned to look at him, and saw that he was staring into his glass. Cancer. It happened quickly, 6 months from diagnosis to the end. Clara's heart clenched. I am sorry. He nodded once, a short, sharp movement. Sophia does not remember her much. She was only 4, and sometimes I do not know if that is mercy or tragedy. He drained his glass and set it down with careful precision. Since then, it has been chaos managing the business, keeping Sophia safe, trying to hold together something that wants to fly apart. He looked at her then, and the vulnerability in his eyes was startling. She is everything, the only thing that matters. I know. Clara's voice came out softer than she intended. I could see that tonight the way you held her. Nicholas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and the firelight caught the silver at his temples. You did not hesitate tonight when you could have walked away when any rational person would have. Why? Clara considered the question and the weight of his attention on her. Because I know what it is to be alone and scared. She looked down at her hands wrapped around the glass. My parents died when I was 19, a car accident, and I had no one, no siblings, no extended family, just suddenly alone. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. I have been struggling ever since, working whatever jobs I could find, living in tiny apartments, trying to keep my head above water. She met his eyes. That janitor job. It was not much, but it was mine, it was stable. And now it is gone, and I am here and I do not know what happens next. Nicholas watched her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. What happens next is that you stay safe until I can eliminate the threat, and then you will have choices. His voice dropped lower. You will not be a prisoner here, Clara. I give you my word. You are not collateral or leverage. You are a person who saved my daughter, and I will not forget that. The air between them felt charged, suddenly thick with something Clara could not name, and she saw his gaze drop briefly to her mouth before returning to her eyes. Thank you. She barely whispered it. For believing me, for bringing me here, even though I know it complicates things for you. It does, he admitted, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. But some complications are worth it. The way he said it made heat bloom in Clara's chest, and she found she could not look away from him, could not break the invisible thread that seemed to be pulling them closer. And she saw something shift in his expression, something dark and hungry and protective all at once. You should sleep, he said finally, though he made no move to stand. Tomorrow Sophia will want to see you, and Mrs. Brennan will have questions, and you need rest. But neither of them moved, and the fire crackled, and Clara felt the foundation of her world shifting beneath her feet as she sat in the warm study across from a dangerous man who looked at her like she mattered. Clara woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through windows she had forgotten to cover, and the disorientation lasted several seconds before memory crashed back, and she remembered where she was and why, and the surreal quality of it all made her wonder if the conversation with Nicholas in the study had been a dream, except she could still feel the warmth of the fire and the weight of his gaze on her skin. Mrs. Brennan brought breakfast on a tray with fresh clothes laid out on the bed, and Clara showered in the massive bathroom and dressed in jeans and a soft sweater that fit perfectly, and she wondered who had guessed her sizes so accurately and whether she should feel grateful or unsettled by the efficiency of it all. Sophia found her in the hallway outside her room, and the little girl's face lit up with such pure joy that Clara's heart squeezed, and Sophia grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the playroom, chattering about her toys and her books, and would Clara please read to her because Mrs. Brennan did the voices all wrong. The playroom was a wonderland of carefully organized shelves and a reading nook with pillows and soft lighting, and Sophia settled against Clara's side with a worn copy of a fairy tale, and Clara read aloud while the child's weight grew heavier as she relaxed into the safety of the moment. Nicholas appeared in the doorway at some point, and Clara looked up to find him watching them with an expression she could not quite decipher, something soft and hungry and almost painful, and when their eyes met, he did not look away, and the air felt charged again the way it had in the study. He joined them, sitting in a chair nearby, and Sophia demanded he listen too, and Clara continued reading, hyper-aware of his presence, and the way his gaze kept drifting from his daughter to her, and lingering on her face, her hands, her mouth. The days began to take on a rhythm that felt both strange and natural, and Clara found herself spending hours with Sophia playing games in the garden, under the watchful eyes of security personnel, reading stories, helping with homework that the private tutor assigned, and the child's laughter became something Clara craved like air. Nicholas was often working in his study or away for meetings that George attended with him, but when he was present, he gravitated toward wherever Clara and Sophia were, and Clara caught him staring more than once with that same intense focus that made her skin prickle with awareness. One afternoon in the library while Sophia napped upstairs, George found Clara browsing the shelves, and his expression was carefully neutral when he spoke. "You are good with her." Clara turned to face him, uncertain where this was leading. "She is easy to care for." George nodded slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, in that military stance he always adopted. "Nicholas has not shown interest in anyone since his wife died 3 years. He paused as if weighing his words. "I have known him for 15 years, and I have never seen him look at someone the way he looks at you." Clara's breath caught, and she did not know what to say to that, did not know if it was warning or observation or something else entirely. George's pale eyes studied her. He is a good man in a bad business, and that child is his entire world. Clara met his gaze steadily. "I know." "Good," George said simply, and then he left her standing among the books with her heart racing and the implications of his words hanging heavy in the air. And she knew that something was shifting between her and Nicholas, something inevitable and terrifying and impossible to resist, and she did not know whether to run toward it or away. The shift came on the 4th night, when George entered the library where Clara was reading with tight urgency in his posture, and he spoke quietly to Nicholas, who had been sitting across the room, working through documents, and Clara watched Nicholas's face transform into something cold and lethal. And he stood and crossed to her and told her they were going into lockdown protocol immediately, and his hand on her shoulder was firm as he guided her toward the secure wing of the house. Sophia was already being moved by Mrs. Brennan, and Clara caught a glimpse of the child's frightened face before Nicholas steered her into a reinforced room lined with monitors and communication equipment, and George was already coordinating with the security team through a headset, and Clara's heart hammered as she realized this was real and immediate and deadly. "What happened?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Nicholas turned to her, and the protective fury in his eyes stole her breath. "Colborne sent a message through one of my informants that he captured 2 days ago, and the man barely survived delivering it, but the threat was clear and specific, and aimed at Sophia and at you." Clara felt ice flood her veins. "Me. He knows you are here, and he is using that knowledge to destabilize me, to make me careless." Nicholas moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the confined space. "I will not let him touch you or my daughter, do you understand me?" The ferocity in his tone made her shiver, and she nodded because words felt impossible, and George was talking rapidly into his headset, issuing commands and checking camera feeds that showed armed men taking positions around the perimeter, and Clara saw the machinery of Nicholas's world in action, efficient, brutal, and utterly foreign to everything she had known before. The hours crawled past, and Nicholas stayed close to her, closer than necessary, and she could feel the tension radiating off him like heat. And at some point, George left to coordinate directly with the teams outside, and then it was just the two of them in the dim light of the monitors, and the silence pressed down heavy with unspoken things. "I am sorry," Clara said quietly, "that I brought this into your life, that I am making you a target." Nicholas turned to her sharply, and the look on his face was almost angry. "You did not bring this, you saved my daughter, and Colburn would have found another pressure point, another way to come at me, because that is what men like him do." He stepped closer, and Clara's back was against the wall, and she could smell his cologne and see the shadow of stubble on his jaw. "You are not the problem, Clara. You are." He stopped, and something flickered in his expression, something raw and unguarded. "You are the first thing in 3 years that has made me feel something other than anger and fear." His hand came up slowly, giving her time to move away, but she did not, and his palm cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone, and Clara's breath caught and her eyes fluttered closed for just a moment, and when she opened them, his face was so close she could feel his breath on her lips, and the world narrowed to the space between them, charged and unbearable, and she saw his gaze drop to her mouth, and her pulse thundered, and he leaned in, and she tilted her face up, and their lips were a breath apart when the security alert blared through the room, shattering the moment, and George's voice crackled over the speaker, reporting movement on the east perimeter, and Nicholas jerked back his hand, falling away, and Clara saw frustration and regret and hunger flash across his face before the cold control slammed back into place, and he turned to the monitors all business again, but his hands were shaking slightly when he gripped the edge of the console, and Clara pressed her palm to her chest, feeling her heart trying to break through her ribs, and knowing that something irrevocable had almost happened, and the wanting of it terrified her almost as much as the danger outside. Clara woke before dawn with a decision already formed in her mind, like a stone settling in her chest, and she lay in the enormous bed staring at the ceiling, knowing what she had to do, even though the thought of it carved something hollow inside her, and she could not keep pretending that her presence here was anything but a danger to the people she had come to care about more than she thought possible. She had heard them late last night after the lockdown ended, when she was supposed to be sleeping, but sleep had been impossible after the near kiss and the adrenaline crash, and she had been walking back from the kitchen with water when she heard Nicholas and George in the study with the door half open, and George's voice had been low and urgent, saying that Colburn's focus on Clara was escalating. That intercepted communications showed he saw her as Nicholas's weakness, and that keeping her at the estate made her a target, and by extension made Sophia more vulnerable, and Nicholas had responded with something she could not hear, but George had said, "You know I am right, and you know what needs to be done," and the silence that followed had been worse than any words. Clara had returned to her room with her heart in pieces, understanding finally that she was not protected here. She was bait. She was a liability. She was the crack in the armor that Colburn would exploit. And no matter what Nicholas felt or what she felt, Sophia's safety had to come first, had to matter more than anything else, and Clara had spent the rest of the night packing her few belongings into the bag she had arrived with, and writing a note she rewrote 6 times before giving up, because there were no words adequate for what she needed to say. She moved through the quiet house as dawn light began filtering through the windows, and she knew the security teams changed shifts at 6, and there would be a brief window when she might slip out if she used the service entrance near the kitchen that she had learned about from Mrs. Brennan, and her hands shook as she descended the stairs and crossed through the hallway, and she was 10 feet from the door when Nicholas's voice stopped her like a physical blow. "Where do you think you are going?" She turned and he was standing at the base of the main staircase, still dressed in the clothes from last night, and his eyes were red-rimmed and his hair was disheveled, and he looked at her with an expression that was equal parts fury and devastation, and Clara's resolve wavered, but she forced herself to stand straight. "I am leaving, and you know I have to, and you know why." Nicholas crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides, and his presence was overwhelming, and his jaw was tight with anger. "You are not leaving, and we are not having this conversation." Clara felt her own anger rise to meet his, because how dare he make this harder than it already was. "I heard you and George last night, and I know that I am making Sophia a target, and I will not do that. I will not be the reason something happens to her. You do not get to make that choice." His voice was low and dangerous. "I decide who stays under my protection, and you are staying." She shook her head, and tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I am not staying so you can martyr yourself protecting me while your daughter is in danger and Colborne uses me to get to you, and I cannot." Her voice cracked. "I cannot be the reason you lose her." Nicholas grabbed her arms, not hard but firm enough to hold her in place, and his face was inches from hers and his eyes were wild. "You think I can just let you walk out that door and disappear and go back to pretending I do not need you here? And maybe that would be easier, maybe that would be safer, but I cannot do it, Clara. I cannot let you go, and not because of duty or obligation, but because I need you here with me, and I am done pretending otherwise." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid, and Clara saw the rawness in Nicholas's face, and felt her own walls crumbling, because this man who commanded fear and respect from hardened criminals was standing in front of her, trembling with the effort of keeping himself together. And she realized with sudden clarity that leaving would not protect him, it would break him, and maybe that mattered more than she had allowed herself to believe. "Then tell me what to do." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me how to fix this, because I cannot watch Sophia get hurt because of me, and I cannot be the weakness that destroys you." Nicholas released her arms and stepped back, running both hands through his hair, and when he looked at her again, the vulnerability was replaced by something sharper, more focused, more dangerous. "I have a plan to end this, to end Colborne permanently, and I have been waiting for the right moment, for all the pieces to fall into place, and they are almost there, but I need time, maybe a week, and I need you to trust me and stay here where I know you are safe until it is finished." Clara searched his face, looking for certainty, looking for the reassurance that he was not just buying time or offering false hope. "You can really end this. I can, and I will." The absolute conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. "Colborne has overextended himself trying to get to me, and he has made himself vulnerable, and George has been feeding him information through a compromised channel that Colborne thinks is secure, and we have been positioning assets for 3 weeks, and when we move, he will not see it coming." Clara felt hope flicker in her chest, fragile and tentative. "And after it is done, what happens to me?" Nicholas closed the distance between them again, and this time his hands were gentle when he cupped her face, tilting it up so she had to meet his eyes. "After it is done, you get to choose. You get to decide if you want to stay, or if you want me to set you up somewhere safe with a new identity and enough money to start over. And I will respect whatever you choose, even if it kills me." She saw the truth of it in his expression, the willingness to let her go, if that was what she needed, and the sight of it made her heart ache. "But I want you here, Clara. I want you in my life and in Sophia's life, and not because I owe you a debt, but because you have become essential, and I am asking you to trust me for 1 more week, and let me finish this." Clara swallowed hard against the lump in her throat and nodded slowly. "I will stay, but I am not going to just hide and wait. I want to help. I want to be part of the solution, not just someone you have to protect." Nicholas started to shake his head, but she pressed her hand against his chest, stopping him. "I know that building where this started better than anyone I know, service corridors and camera blind spots, and how systems work, and if there is any way that knowledge can help you, then let me be useful. Let me have some control in this. She saw him warring with himself, saw the protective instinct battling against respect for her strength, and finally, he exhaled slowly. There might be something you can help with, something that does not put you directly in danger, and we can talk to George and see if your knowledge fits into the plan, but you follow orders exactly, and if I say you pull back immediately. No arguments. Agreed. The word came out firm and sure, and she saw surprise flicker in his eyes, followed by something that looked like admiration, and he reached for her hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent heat flooding through her entire body, and his eyes never left hers. And the promise in that gaze was more binding than any words could be, and Clara knew that whatever came next, whatever danger they faced together, she had already made her choice. Weeks ago, when a scared little girl had needed her, and she had chosen to step into the fire rather than walk away. The plan moved into motion 4 days later, and Clara found herself standing in the service corridor of the Meridian complex at 2 in the morning, with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, and George Thornhill's voice in her earpiece was calm and steady as he guided Nicholas's team through the building using the blueprints and access codes Clara had provided from her months working there, and she had mapped every camera blind spot, every locked maintenance door, every ventilation shaft wide enough for a man to crawl through, and now she watched the security monitors in the control room, with 2 of Nicholas's men flanking her, as the operation unfolded with brutal efficiency. Colburn had been using the building's sub-basement for meetings, thinking the location secure and anonymous. But Clara had remembered the unusual activity she had seen on late shifts, and the men in expensive suits who did not belong. And when she had mentioned it to Nicholas, his eyes had gone sharp and focused. And suddenly, her insignificant observations had become the keystone of everything. And now she watched the feeds as Nicholas and 8 of his best operatives converged on Colburn's location from 3 directions, using the routes Clara had shown them, and there was no firefight, no dramatic standoff, just swift, overwhelming force, and Colburn was taken alive along with 4 of his lieutenants, and it was over in less than 6 minutes. Clara's hands were shaking when George's voice came through again, saying, "Package secured, all teams exfiltrating," and she felt the tension drain out of her body so fast she had to grip the desk to stay upright, and one of the men beside her, whose name was Marcus, gave her a small approving nod and said, "You did good." And coming from these hardened professionals, it felt like a battlefield commendation. She was back at the estate by 4 in the morning, and she paced the library, unable to sit, unable to rest. And it was almost 6 when she heard vehicles in the drive, and she moved to the window and saw Nicholas emerging from the lead car, and even from a distance, she could see the exhaustion in his posture and the blood on his shirt. And she was out the door and down the stairs before conscious thought caught up with her body, and when he walked through the front entrance, their eyes met, and everything else fell away. "It is done." His voice was rough and weary. "Colborne is being delivered to people who have wanted him for a very long time, and his organization is scattered, and the threat is over." Clara closed the distance between them and searched his face, looking for injuries, looking for regret, looking for anything that suggested a cost too high. But she saw only bone-deep tiredness and relief, and something that looked like hope. "You are safe now." He reached up and touched her cheek, and his hand was warm and solid and real. "You can go anywhere you want, and I will make sure you have everything you need. Money documents a future, and I will keep my promise. But before you decide, I need you to know that what I said before was not about the danger or the circumstances, and I want you to stay, Clara. I want you here with Sophia and me, not as someone under my protection, but as someone who belongs here, as someone I cannot imagine my life without. And I know I have no right to ask, and I know you deserve better than a man like me, but I am asking anyway." Clara felt tears spill over because this powerful, dangerous man was standing in his own foyer, looking at her like she held his entire world in her hands. And maybe she did. And maybe that was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. And she realized her answer had been written in every moment since the night she had chosen to protect a frightened child, instead of walking away. I am not going anywhere. Her voice was steady despite the tears. I choose this. I choose you and Sophia and whatever life we can build together, and maybe I am crazy, but I have never been more sure of anything. Nicholas exhaled like he had been holding his breath for days, and he pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly for the first time. And it was not gentle or tentative, but fierce and claiming and full of everything they had been holding back. And Clara kissed him back with equal intensity, and felt something inside her finally click into place, like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. And when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and he rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "Thank you." And she was about to respond when small footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Sophia appeared in her nightgown rubbing her eyes. And when she saw them together, she broke into a brilliant smile and ran down saying, "Clara, you are staying. You are really staying." And Clara knelt down and caught the little girl in a hug and said, "Yes, sweetheart, I am staying." And Sophia pulled back and looked at her with those solemn dark eyes, so like her father's, and said, "Can I call you Mama?" And Clara's heart cracked wide open, and she looked up at Nicholas and saw the emotion raw on his face. And she looked back at Sophia and said, "I would be honored." And the little girl wrapped her arms around Clara's neck, and Nicholas knelt beside them and put his arms around them both. And Clara thought about how 6 weeks ago she had been invisible, struggling alone, scraping by. And now she was here surrounded by people who saw her, who valued her, who loved her. And she had become something she never thought possible. Not a janitor, not a victim, not invisible, but essential, protected, cherished, and finally home.